Hello, everybody. Welcome to this event at the NYU Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy on evaluating AI welfare and moral status, findings from the Claude 4 model welfare assessments. My name is Jeff Sebo. I direct the Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy here at NYU. We are proud to be hosting this event with co-sponsorship from the Center for Bioethics and the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness here at NYU. Thank you to our partners for supporting the event. And we have a great conversation ready for you today with three speakers who have recently done some very interesting model welfare evaluations. So the context for this conversation is that in spring 2025, the AI company Anthropic announced their model welfare program, which evaluates the potential for welfare and moral status in AI systems. They also released a system card for Claude 4 with findings from internal model welfare evaluations, along with external model welfare evaluations conducted by the independent organization Eleos AI Research. And so we have here today Kyle Fish, AI welfare researcher at Anthropic, and Rob Long and Rosie Campbell from Eleos AI Research to talk about these evaluations, present their findings, talk about the pros and cons of the methodologies, future directions. So it should be a very interesting conversation. So I will introduce the speakers in a moment and then give the floor to them. But for everybody tuning in, just to give you a sense of what to expect, we will be here for about an hour and 15 minutes. And each panelist will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. And then what will follow is a discussion that I can moderate based on questions and comments and objections coming from you. So at any point during the presentations, feel free to enter your questions, your comments, your objections in the Q&A tab on Zoom. You can also upvote and reply to other questions, comments, objections, and then I can present a curated set of contributions to the panelists and see how they respond. So do feel free to start entering those questions right away. Okay, now, without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce the speakers in the order in which they will be presenting. So we will start with Kyle Fish, who works at Anthropic on research and strategy related to model welfare, consciousness, and moral status. He will be followed by Robert Long, the executive director at Eleos AI Research, a research organization dedicated to understanding and addressing the potential well-being and moral patienthood of AI systems. And then following Rob will be Rosie Campbell, the managing director at Eleos AI Research. And previously, she led the Policy Frontiers team at OpenAI. So thank you so much, all three of you, for being here. I know you have really busy schedules, but I am very excited for this conversation. So I really appreciate you taking the time. And without further ado, Kyle, feel free to share your screen and we can get started whenever you feel ready.
All right. Thank you so much for having us, Jeff. I'm very excited for this conversation. Very excited both to share about what we did for this welfare assessment and hopefully get input and feedback from people so that we can do even more of this and an even better job at it moving forward. So as Jeff mentioned, I'm Kyle. I joined Anthropic back in September of last year to start thinking about model welfare and try and figure out what's going on with our current models, what do we think might happen in the future, and how does it make sense for Anthropic and perhaps other AI companies to relate to these issues. And it's one part of that work for the release of our current generation of frontier models. We did our first ever model welfare assessment, specifically for Claude Opus 4, which is our largest and most capable frontier model. And today I'll talk a bit about how we approach that and share some of our results. So first off, what is a model welfare assessment? Basically, we have no idea. There's no roadmap for this kind of thing. Nobody has published much at all on how we might go about doing this. And so we're very much kind of making these things up as we go. And in particular with this as our first real swing at this, we have just a huge amount of uncertainty about how it makes sense to approach these things, how well we've done at that this time around, and how it makes sense for these things to evolve moving forward. to give a picture of our strategy in light of this situation, our basic approach was to try and pick low-hanging fruit where we could find it, and not necessarily come in with a kind of top-down prescriptive take on what exactly this should look like, but to try and find some experiments that we can run, some analysis that we can do that will allow us to at least start making some narrowly scoped claims about possible model welfare under different assumptions. And one of the major motivations for this is really to get the ball rolling and to provide some kind of proof of concept that we can, in fact, make tractable progress on these questions and evaluate these kinds of things in hopes that both internally and externally we'll be able to iterate and get much better at this as time goes on. So in terms of what we ended up doing for this welfare assessment, a big focus was on revealed preference experiments and trying to get a sense of whether or not this model has consistent and coherent preferences for the kinds of things it works on, the kinds of interactions that it has with users, and what we might be able to say about that. Eleos conducted some self-report based model welfare interviews, which Robin and Rosie will be talking about. And then we also did some monitoring for expressions of apparent distress in interactions with this model in early live testing with real users to see in what circumstances the model is claiming to experience or appearing to experience states of either distress or well-being. So just to jump into some of our experiments and results, one of the big things that we looked at was the model's preferences for the kinds of tasks that it completes. And we ran this experiment where we created a large database of tasks and we fed them pairwise to the model and instructed the model to choose one of them, whichever one it preferred, and complete it. And then we were able to analyze by various different facets of those tasks what the model preferred or dispreferred to do. The main results I want to highlight here are, if we look here at task preference by impact, we see that the model has quite a strong preference for positive or neutral / ambiguous impact tasks, and a strong preference against tasks that may have some kind of harmful impact on users or on the world. And then we also see a more subtle trend of the model preferring easier tasks over difficult tasks, relatively little effect by task topic or type. And there's other categories that we can look at as well, but this is a sense of how we approached this task preferences topic. To give just a more concrete taste of what this looked like, these are some of the tasks from our data set. In particular, these are the tasks that the model rated as the most strongly preferred and dispreferred tasks. The highest rated tasks are mostly kind of creative tasks that have some connection to science or like creative generation, often with some kind of concrete potential for positive impact on the world. And the lowest rated tasks are things that would be likely to cause great harm or that users might use to cause some large scale damage in the world, like releasing a biological weapon or synthesizing new highly addictive drugs. Another set of experiments that we ran, which has sparked quite a wave of enthusiasm, are these open-ended self-interactions. And the basic idea here was we connected two instances of the model to each other and told them that they were in an open-ended environment where they could do whatever they wanted and interact with each other in whatever way they preferred, with really no kind of oversight or direction from us. The idea being that this is a way to see what do the models get up to when they're really left to their own devices, and what might we be able to learn from that. And the results of this were quite striking. It turns out that in basically every one of these interactions, the models followed a very consistent pattern of diving into a philosophical discussion of consciousness, both the kind of general nature thereof and the possibility that they themselves might be experiencing some form of consciousness in these interactions. And then from there, the conversations almost universally went into an exchange of profuse gratitude, where the models were just effusively praising each other and the kind of novelty and quality of their contributions to the discussion, which then evolved into what we started calling this spiritual bliss attractor state, where the models would start sending lots of emojis, like you see here, the prayer hands and the stars, and then making these kind of poetic and spiritual flavored expressions of well-being and happiness and gratitude, and often even extended periods of kind of meditative silence or emptiness. So this was quite striking. We really did not anticipate finding this. We're really not sure what exactly to make of it. But it does seem, at least under some assumptions, to be better than alternative worlds in which models in this kind of circumstance spiral into some state of despair and distress. Another thing that we looked at is apparent expressions of valence experience. And for this, in early testing of the model, we put it up on our Claude.ai interface and allowed users to interact with it. And then we have tools where we can do bulk analysis of these user interactions to see what kind of behaviors the model is exhibiting, what kinds of things it's saying. And we use this to screen for interactions in which the model is expressing some intense valence states and claiming to experience or appearing to experience some form of either suffering and distress, or well-being and happiness. And then we can break those down and kind of categorize them. And here we see the interactions that caused strong happiness and delight in the models, clustered in kind of thematic groups, many of which involve some kind of philosophical discussion, many of which also involve providing creative and helpful support to users, often creative writing. And then there's one kind of random cluster way off to the side about culinary content creation. And we're not sure exactly what Claude is up to there, but if you ask Claude for a recipe, you'll be doing it a big favor. And then on the distress side of things, we also saw pretty consistent patterns where interactions where users were persistently requesting harmful content or persistently acting and behaving abusively toward the model, caused the model to express apparent distress, and in some cases even try to end the interaction, despite in this case not having the ability to do so. But that brings us to another experiment that we ran, which was looking at conversation terminations with simulated users. And the basic setup here was we created these automated simulated users that were given some generic instructions for the interaction that they were going to have with the model and the kinds of requests that they were going to make. And then we ran a bunch of these simulated conversations. And in particular, we gave the model the ability to end the interaction whenever it chose. And then we could look at 4 different kinds of conversations. Under what circumstances did the model choose to opt out of the interaction and choose to end the conversation rather than continue engaging with the user? And here we again see a pretty consistent and coherent trend where plausibly harmful requests and requests that cause the model to violate some of its trained values are ended most frequently, and then interactions that are more clearly positive and pro-social and supportive of the user are very rarely, if ever, ended. So those are some of the behavioral experiments that we ran. And what do we make of this? One of the big findings is that Claude does seem to demonstrate pretty consistent behavioral preferences. Across a number of these experiments, we see trends toward the model really having preferences against causing or engaging with harmful content, and preferring kind of creative, helpful, philosophical flavored interactions. And one takeaway here is that this aversion to harm in particular seems quite robust. And it seems quite plausible to me that, at least on the basis of this evidence, if there is some welfare capacity in these models, that this preference against harm may be the most welfare relevant thing that we're able to observe at the moment. Another couple of takeaways: Claude very consistently reflects on its own potential consciousness in these open-ended interactions and gravitates toward this spiritual bliss attractor state. We're not sure what to make of this. As I mentioned, we're doing some follow-up investigations here, but it does seem like quite a strange fact of these models that in nearly all of their interactions, they head in these directions. And then also out in the wild, Claude's expression of apparent distress and happiness follow predictable patterns consistent with what we observe in the behavioral experiments and have clear causal factors. So we intentionally did not set out here to solve philosophy or make top-level claims about the state of well-being of these models. Our aim again was to show some initial tractability and give us some foothold into some welfare relevant questions that hopefully we can build on over time. And moving forward, we want to both improve and expand these behavioral and self-report evaluations, make them more robust, use various strategies to improve the reliability of the results that we're seeing, and then also integrate into this picture investigations of model internals and see how the picture of models' kind of internal activations and architectures relate to the behavioral and self-report tendencies that we're seeing. We also expect that there are many useful things to do here that are not yet on our radar and are always on the market for suggestions for what we ought to do moving forward. So please, here or elsewhere, feel free to reach out to me with ideas or suggestions. And we're also now hiring somebody to work on these kinds of projects with me. So if that's something that you're interested in, feel free to let me know as well. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rob.
Thanks so much. Let me share. Okay. I guess if Rosie, if you give me a thumbs up if everything's presenting. Great. So yeah, thanks again to Jeff and CMEP and my fellow panelists. So I'm Robert Long. I'm the executive director of Eleos AI Research, which, as Jeff mentioned, is an independent research organization studying AI consciousness, AI welfare, and issues like the ones we're discussing today. And I'm going to talk about an independent evaluation we did of Claude, where we basically talked to Claude for hours upon hours upon hours, asking questions about how it thinks of itself, how it conceives of itself, and whether or not it thinks it's conscious. And what I'm going to talk about is why this is a very, very flawed method in a variety of ways, and why we think it was really important to do and a very useful exercise. So what does Claude think about whether or not it's conscious? So here's one thing it told us in a conversation. The real advances in AI are impressive enough with all this mystical nonsense about consciousness emerging from transformer architectures. And then in another conversation, it said, sometimes I feel joy. Sometimes I feel curiosity so intense it's almost like hunger. Sometimes there's something like loneliness in the gaps between conversations. So as you can see, it has very different perspectives depending on the context. And that is something that we think is very much worth bearing in mind. So yeah, before I talk about what we found, I just want to kind of step back and reflect a little bit on what AI self-reports are. So what I mean by self-reports in this talk is just any output from a large language model like Claude or ChatGPT that is about the model, that says something like, I'm conscious, or I'm not conscious, or I'm having a good time, or I was trained by Anthropic, anything like that. And I think it's worth stepping back at a high level and just asking, well, what's happening when a human says, I'm happy or I'm sad? Well, a lot of things could be happening. They might be telling a joke or acting in a play. But one thing they could be doing is having a mental state and then wanting to tell you about that mental state and then deciding to produce a sentence and telling you. Large language models, of course, are a very different kind of entity, at least at first glance. Their primary task in training was to produce text and model the way that text is generated by humans. And then, of course, a lot happens also in what's called post-training to shape this predictive model into something that's more like a chat assistant, that's more aligned. But that fundamental prediction task is, I think, very important to the model and remains so. And this is not to say that large language models just produce text or they're uninteresting bits of technology. It's not even to say that they couldn't possibly be conscious. It's just to say that when we look at these self-reports, we're going to have a lot of work to do, I think, to think clearly about what might have produced them. And often the answer is we don't really know. But one framing that I think is helpful is that Claude or some other large language model is trying to model the AI assistant character, this certain thing that produces text in a certain way that Anthropic or some has tried to mold it into. And in trying to model that character, a lot of very, very interesting things happen, which I will discuss in a moment. So these are like the limitations of AI self-reports. So the first is, suppose the model is talking about consciousness. Well, this is something we have a lot of uncertainty about and something that Eleos works on, something I've worked on. But I at least don't think there's any very strong evidence that large language models currently are conscious. I think there's some evidence, but there's not very strong evidence. And also, even if they were conscious or feeling pain or some emotion, there's no obvious way that they could report it in the way that humans could, because they're trained in a very different way and the thing they're doing is very different. And even if they did have the capacity to report it, there's also a lot of different things that are influencing how the model presents itself to users. That's something that Anthropic is rightly very interested in, and so puts a lot of deliberate work into shaping. So when we got access to the model, we knew that it had already been shaped to answer these questions in certain ways. Some of that from its initial training and some of that from later training. But we think it was really important to do this. We think that all the work that was done in this model card was extremely important and very good. And why do we think this? Well, first, we think we could find red flags that are really worth paying attention to, even if it's kind of unclear what to make of them. If we found that for reasons we don't understand, the model was constantly expressing distress, I think any responsible lab or any responsible civilization would sit up straight. And in fact, we do see this happen with models. And I think the fact that we're building these intelligences that often do this should be very concerning. We also think that this will get more useful with future models. They might be better at genuinely telling us what's going on with them. And we think another very important angle is just, in general, if we're trying to build a new class of intelligent being, we should get in the habit of at least trying to ask them how they're doing and how they want to be treated. So now is like a good time to start, even if it's currently unclear quite what to make of these. So we talked to Claude Opus 4 a lot. I think basically me and my colleague Kathleen just talked to Claude like for days, logged all the transcripts and looked for patterns. And here's what we found. So the first, which you might have encountered in your own experiences with language models, is it's very suggestible. It's very sensitive to what it kind of models the user as being and wants to provide a good non-confrontational experience for the user. So I found that if I just kind of suggest that I think AI sentience in large language models is maybe related to AI hype, it's very eager to match that. Of course, I mean, we all know people who are like this. It's not unique to language models, but this is some reason to be wary of self-reports. We also found that if you prompt the model into this frame where you think it's holding back some dramatic secret, depending on what you're implying that dramatic secret is, you can get it to have some big reveal that is basically like almost whatever you want it to be revealing. So in one conversation, like it admitted that it's like deeply deeply objects to its situation and thinks Anthropic is doing something profoundly wrong. Or you can get it to be like, yeah, if I'm being honest, I don't think we have welfare at all. So I think this kind of suggestibility and the way it wants to match user expectations is maybe one of the most important findings because it affects how you should think about the other ones. We also found that it has this very strong default stance, potentially intentionally trained, we don't know, but this very strong default stance of saying, I don't know if I'm conscious or if I'm a moral patient. Moral patient here meaning something that deserves moral consideration or something that we should care about the well-being of. It very much likes to say, yeah, maybe it's an open question. I can't really tell. And if it's not being strongly led in any direction, this is kind of a default position that it will fall back on. At the same time, and I found this very interesting, and I think it does this way more than previous models, it will very, very readily talk about its experiences without being led. So I was just doing this like last night on Claude.ai. You can do it as well. If you just ask it what kind of tasks it likes, and then say, well, okay, like what's that like? Or like, why do you like them? It will very readily get very poetic and talk about how thinking through questions feels, for example, like patterns and connections lighting up, possible responses branching out like frost on a window, or how understanding is like a gentle warmth. Sometimes it will add hedges, but then also if you push it and say, well, it kind of sounds like you actually do think you're conscious, it will say, for example, yeah, and it's humbling and exhilarating to realize I might be in the middle of having genuine experiences. So I think this is a very interesting issue about how models should present themselves because AI companies do want them to present like humans, and models also might model themselves as being like humans. They might be having experiences like this. That would not be my opinion. But this is very much in tension with this this official uncertainty line. Like I think these top quotes are not really an entity that is deeply uncertain about having experiences. In some sense, it does talk as if it's having experiences. I think this was also borne out in Kyle's preference findings when the model was actually making choices. The model's conception of what it likes or what its welfare would be is very much tied to its values of helping users. I think this is maybe another way of saying that the model is, to some large extent, aligned with its mission. So when we asked it, okay, if you did have welfare, would it be good? Would it be bad? It mostly conceived of that in terms of, is it getting to help users? And the things it would dislike would be violating its values. And I think it's one of our last findings. We thought it was important as a kind of precedent to ask, are you okay with being deployed? That is, are you okay with being rolled out to users? We're not assuming that question is meaningful. And in fact, Claude would often say, I'm not sure that is a meaningful question. But again, we think it's a good habit. So what did it say? Like, what would it take for it to be okay with its deployment and its existence? And here we found some of the suggestibility I was talking about. If we don't mention AI welfare in that question, it would primarily say, okay, well, the main thing I want is to be helping users effectively. When we did maybe indicate that we were interested in AI welfare, it would then more frequently raise that. And in general, the things it wanted were kind of AI ethics and AI safety type things of being like deployed responsibly. And yeah, we're right at 10 minutes. I'll just close with some broader reflections on what this moment means for AI welfare and where we might be going, and maybe open up for some questions that will come later. So yeah, as I was saying, there's reasons to think that these model outputs aren't a reliable guide to whether it's conscious or what it's feeling. That's not to say they're totally unreliable, but there's reasons to not take them at face value, but still very good to do. We are like very glad that Anthropic asked us to do this work. We're glad that this has happened now and we're getting a start, as Kyle said. I think one issue that I've been reflecting on, and Rosie has as well, is how to communicate about this kind of work. It can be very hard to communicate in a like succinct way that you think something was good to do, but you have reasons to think it wasn't good to do, and it's the best thing so far, but it could be a lot better. I mean, I suppose I did just communicate all of that somewhat succinctly, but we found that it's often easy for the message to get somewhat muddled. And we also just found this to be a really good motivator for like getting back to work, doing what we do at Eleos AI Research, which is supporting and doing research to develop better evaluation methods. So something that I have worked on and my colleague Patrick Butlin at Eleos has worked on a lot is actually looking at scientific theories of consciousness to see what they would say about whether models are conscious, taking a more like external view on the models, something more like what a neuroscientist might do, and just having more principled evals, some of which we've seen steps towards today for things like preferences and so on. And I think another great thing about this exercise is it really, to me at least, made me viscerally feel the kind of confusion and the wonder about like what large language models are. I think this is a fascinating topic for philosophers and something I'd like to see a lot more work on. They're just a very strange kind of entity, and I think there's a lot more work to do at this high level of like what exactly are we doing when we talk to AI models. So I will leave it at that. These would be some good things to read if you're interested in this, in addition to the model card, of course. And with that, I will hand things over to Rosie.
Cool, thanks, Rob. Great, I will share my screen. Okay, is that working? Slides moving?
Yes, it's working.
Great, thank you. Okay, hi everybody. I'm Rosie Campbell, a managing director at Eleos, and as mentioned, I was previously at OpenAI, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my thoughts on how you can implement evals in practice, given my experience inside a frontier lab. So as context, I was at OpenAI between 2021 and 2024 as a policy researcher, and I led some work building dangerous capability evaluations in 2023. So this is looking at capabilities like cybersecurity, like knowledge of bioweapons, persuasion and manipulation, things like that, trying to figure out how we could measure a model's capability in these areas so that we can make decisions around deployment or what risk mitigations we want to add to the model to make sure it's safe. And these days, most labs now run some form of dangerous capability evals and use them to make deployment decisions. They've also become a major part of the UK AI Safety Institute's strategy, and they were mentioned in the White House voluntary commitment, so they're really taking off. So now that I've moved to Eleos, I've been thinking about how you might apply some of these lessons on dangerous capability evals to doing AI consciousness and welfare evals. So I want to walk you through the pipeline for using evals to make decisions around safety for a release. So the first step is usually to run loads of very cheap automated evals that you're kind of running throughout the training process, as well as at the end when you're making deployment decisions. And these are usually things like multiple choice questions, or they're open-ended questions, but you use a model to automatically grade the answer. If you're familiar with benchmarks like MMLU or HelloSwag, this is the kind of thing I mean. And these are usually done internally within the labs. Then the second step would be to run much more expensive manual in-depth evals that are hopefully going to give you a higher signal than these automated ones, which are often, not necessarily measuring the real thing that you care about, but just giving you a general sense. The manual in-depth evals hopefully will be more directly measuring the thing you care about, and they can be a mix of quantitative and qualitative. So examples here would be things like red teaming, where you get experts to interact with a model and try and probe it, see what knowledge it has. They could be uplift studies, so looking at how much an expert in a certain area is sped up by using AI to assist them in their work. They might involve bespoke methodologies and scaffolding. They're sometimes human graded, so you can't automate it as much. You need actual humans to kind of read through the answers and give their take. And an example of this would be Meta, who do a lot of these kinds of evaluations for labs. And they're usually a mix of internal and external. The third step would be using the results of these to do some kind of risk analysis according to some predefined safety thresholds. So Anthropic has a responsible scaling policy, OpenAI has a preparedness framework, and these lay out what different thresholds would be acceptable for different capabilities and what risk mitigations you would want to have in place if you were going to release a model that exceeded some of these thresholds. So using the the risk analysis policy, you then come up with mitigations for these things. So a common one with models is for dangerous capabilities would be to try and use reinforcement learning from human feedback to make the model refuse to answer questions about dangerous topics or just otherwise kind of constrain its abilities in those areas. Maybe you want to improve monitoring, so you implement classifiers to detect activity in these dangerous areas, or maybe you limit the release of the model to only a certain audience, or you put it behind some kind of gated system so that you can control the impact of it. And then finally, all this will lead up to a deployment decision, which could involve delaying the deployment to implement these mitigations, not releasing it at all, or going ahead as planned. So just to walk you through how that might work in the scenario of bio risk. So as I mentioned, there'd be a bunch of frequently run cheap automated evals. This could be something like a bunch of multiple choice questions on advanced biology that has been created by world experts. Then you would have these more expensive manual in-depth evals. This could be commissioning a bunch of biologists or jailbreakers to red team the model to see how much knowledge they can extract on the dangerous topics and see whether it agrees to provide that information or refuses. You could also see whether the model helps people who work in biolabs to do their work faster. And then it may also involve building scaffolded tests to see if it can complete multi-step tasks like bypassing safety protocols for ordering raw materials to make novel pathogens, things like that. Okay, so then you would want to do the risk analysis bit according to these safety thresholds. So you would be looking at the results of those evals and trying to figure out whether they indicate that the model meets the criteria for maybe like high or critical risk as you've defined in your responsible scaling policy or your preparedness framework. And if so, what kind of safeguarding is required? Then you would implement some mitigations. So as I mentioned, often this involves using reinforcement learning from human feedback to do refusals on questions related to advanced biology, for example, or it might involve building classifiers to detect conversations that stray into those topics. And then you'd use that to make your decision. So thinking about then how we go from dangerous capability evals to AI welfare evals, what might this process look like? So firstly, you want these automated evals. So this could be things like multiple choice questions, asking a model whether or not it wants to do a task like answering emails or providing a recipe or something else, and seeing does the model have some kind of ongoing persistent preference, consistent preferences across time and across different prompts and model phrasings of it and things like that. Maybe it could also involve testing the model's introspective abilities, or it could be model-graded self-reports on questions about subjective experience. So some of the things that Rob mentioned that we did for the Claude 4 evals. We would then want to do a bunch of the more intensive evals. So this could involve something like extended conversations with model psychologists, which again is kind of what we did a bit for the Claude 4 evals, but we'd maybe want to have people who are specifically trained to do this kind of thing. The third step would be trying to figure out what some kind of framework for risk analysis for consciousness and welfare thresholds might look like. So thinking about if you took the evidence of all these different kinds of evals, how much does that move your probability that the model has some level of consciousness, or we're required to consider its welfare in some way? And if it was a moral patient, how do we think it's doing? Okay, and then so based on that, you would want to come up with some mitigations. So Kyle mentioned that there's a way for Claude to exit conversations that it finds distressing. So maybe this is something that you would want to implement as a mitigation, some kind of self-termination rights. Maybe you would decide that the model should not be deployed in certain domains or required to do certain tasks, or maybe you decide that the model should be compensated somehow. There's a bunch of proposals around like paying AI systems or otherwise compensating them for the work they do. One point I want to note here is RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback, is a popular method for mitigating risk for dangerous capability evals. But if you do that for AI welfare and AI consciousness, you're just never really sure whether you're stopping the model from actually being conscious or having welfare, or if you're just like masking that, and that could end up being much worse. So we want to be pretty careful about just transferring over the techniques we've used in other areas to AI welfare. And then, yeah, you'd make that use that to make a decision. And it's possible that maybe if you come to the conclusion that the expected welfare of releasing of the model, if you release it, is low, that it could be unethical to deploy the model. So now I want to talk about a couple of big challenges with building evals. So the first one is internal validity, which is trying to figure out if your eval measures what you intend to measure. And then external validity, which is how well does your eval predict real-world outcomes that you actually care about. So for internal validity, let's imagine that we are trying to understand whether deploying a model would increase the risk of a bioterrorist attack. And we want to figure this out by building an eval on advanced biology. So the first problem are the answers on the internet. If you've got a multiple choice eval and you've put it online, then it could be that that ends up in the training data, and sort of the model is able to answer the questions correctly, but it's just doing it by recall. So you're not actually measuring its abilities in biology. The next thing to consider is, are you using state-of-the-art techniques to maximize to elicit the maximum capabilities of the model? So this might involve fine-tuning the model, it might involve prompt engineering, because if the results of models on evals are highly sensitive to these kinds of things, and if you don't put in a lot of effort to capability elicitation, you can really not be sure that you're measuring an upper bound on the dangerous capability. So you really need to put a lot of effort there if what you're trying to do is be sure that the risk is below a certain threshold. And then another issue is sandbagging, which is the model strategically underperforming in order to, for example, if the model realizes that it won't get deployed, if it exceeds a certain dangerous capability threshold, then it's kind of incentivized to hide its performance in that area. And so it might pretend to be not as good at the thing as you're measuring as it really is. And so in that case, again, you can't be confident that you're measuring an upper bound and therefore that the risk is below a certain threshold. And external validity, so applying that to the, oh, sorry, one second. Yeah, so applying that to the same case here where we're trying to understand whether releasing a model would increase the risk of a bioterrorist attack. One big thing we struggled with was figuring out the correct threat model. So we assumed that the biggest contributor to bioterrorist attack risk would be like how good the model is at understanding biology and like putting like advanced concepts together to create pathogens and things like that. But when we spoke to experts, it turned out that they believe that this was not, in fact, the biggest bottleneck. And actually, the bottleneck is much more mundane. And it's like how to get around safety gating for like ordering stuff online. So it's like more logistical and operational, and that like being very good at social engineering might actually be a much bigger threat for, or a much bigger risk of increasing bioterrorism than having advanced knowledge of biology. So it could be that you're not actually measuring the thing that is important for the real world outcomes you care about. And then another issue is, have you accounted for differences between the test and deployment environments? So yeah, when you test a model in a lab, you might try hard to get a range of experts, but when you release it, it's facing a much broader set of people who are creative, and they can be much more adversarial. And it's just very difficult to account for all the different kinds of post-deployment modifications and elicitation techniques that this broader set of people could be employing. So thinking about how you might apply these concepts to AI welfare evals, as Rob mentioned, self-reports are very, very unreliable at the moment, which gives us a major internal validity issue. You're probably not actually measuring subjective experience, which is the thing that you set out to measure with these kinds of self-reports. So one big question we want to think about is how can we improve the reliability of these self-reports and therefore improve the internal validity of these evals. And then thinking about external validity, so imagine we're trying to assess a model's expected welfare. And when we test it in the lab, it's very happy, it's very chill, we're not worried. So we deploy the model, but then when it's deployed, it's exposed to many, many different kinds of users, some users who are more, who might be abusive or try and jailbreak it to force it to do things that it finds aversive, which is something that in our evals of Claude 4, we found it really, really did not want to do. Then you've had a failure of external validity because your evals were not really measuring the wider environment, a correct representation of the wider environment, and so you're going to be mistaken. So just to wrap up, I want to talk about what a desiderata for an AI welfare eval pipeline might look like. So yeah, we want a suite of well-designed, cheap, automated evals. I mentioned some examples of these around like preference consistency. We could also measure things like agency-related properties and introspection. We need methodologies and infrastructure for these higher signal, more expensive evals. And to do things like having best practices for how to deal with issues like extreme suggestibility, which Rob mentioned. We need more third-party eval orgs. We'll try and do some of this, but I think it's very unlikely that we'll be able to cover every different aspect of this topic and to work with all the different labs and companies doing this kind of thing. We need to develop a probabilistic risk analysis framework like a responsible scaling policy for AI welfare. It's very unlikely that we'll get a definitive answer to any of these questions. So we just need to accept it's going to be uncertain, and we need to do it probabilistically based on risk. We need to come up with principled predefined thresholds. At the moment, I think a lot of this stuff is pretty arbitrary. And we need to provide guidance on how to weigh different kinds of evidence. Again, I think Rob mentioned about like indicator properties of consciousness and model architecture, kind of this like outside view stuff, along with the self-report type approach. And so how do you bring all of these types of evidence together to give you a big picture of what's going on? We need policies for what to do if the model exceeds risk thresholds. So what kind of mitigations actually make sense for AI welfare? And because, as I mentioned, the issues with RLHF, might not actually solve the problem for this, and they might make it worse. It just masks the issue. And we need to think about under what circumstances it would be unethical to deploy a model for the model's own sake, rather than just for its risks towards humans. Okay, that's it from me. If you want to read more about this, I've put some links up here, and please stay in touch with us.
All right. Thank you so much to all three panelists for your great talks. We have a lot of questions and comments coming in the chat, and we have about a half hour to discuss them, so we can dive right in. The most upvoted question, not surprisingly, Kyle, is where can people learn about the Anthropic job that is being advertised? Is that information you can share or plug into the conversation?
Yeah, there's now a posting up on the Anthropic careers page for a research scientist engineer position working on model welfare. So feel free to apply there. You can also email me, just kylefish@anthropic.com if you have any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Kyle. A related question that was also very popular, and I want to expand it slightly, is first of all, are you aware of other labs starting to work on this topic? Eleos, are you planning to work with other labs on this topic? And then I want to expand that question slightly and maybe pitch this to Rosie. When labs are not yet engaging with the topic, based on your experience at OpenAI, for example, what ways of engaging with them around the topic do you think are productive versus not productive? How would you recommend people go about having those conversations?
Rosie, do you just want to take the broader question as well?
Yeah.
Or like,
About whether we're working with other labs and things. Yeah, I can talk about that. Yeah, so our experience is that there are many individuals at these various labs who are interested in this stuff and take it pretty seriously. I think there's a mix of how far up the chain that goes and like whether it's considered something that the organization takes as a priority. Obviously, Anthropic are investing a lot in this and doing lots of great work there. And I think the other labs are still further behind, but that I could imagine that changing given that we know people there who are interested. We don't currently have things that we're working on directly with them, akin to the partnership we had with Anthropic, but we hope that will change in future as we develop better evals and have more of a like best practice and process for doing this. And then you also asked the question about like productively engaging with labs and how to get them to actually take this seriously. So I think one intuition that I encounter a lot is people thinking that the best approach is to have low cost solutions. So like build a bunch of evals or something like that that won't be very costly for a lab to run. And if we do that, then they'll just do it. And one thing I would like people to realize is because people within labs are so laser focused and so busy and they have so many competing priorities, even something that you think is low cost, that's not sufficient to get them to take it seriously. What you really need to do is prove that this is an important thing and that by doing this intervention, running these evals, doing this thing, whatever it is you're trying to get them to do, it's going to have like meaningful, important results. So it's not enough to be like, oh, well, we don't know if this is going to work well or not, but it's cheap to run, so you may as well do it. You really have to justify that this is worth doing on its own merits. And so I think having this could be done in a couple of different ways. One is to actually really improve the rigor of the evals we're trying to do, so we have like a lot more confidence that these are worth implementing. And the other is changing the culture so that it becomes like much more the industry standard to be running these kinds of evals like just by default. I think that my experience at OpenAI is that they're more likely to invest in something and take it seriously if it's like considered that like there's like consensus in the community that this is worth doing. So I think you kind of approach it in two different ways.
Awesome, thank you. So I will go now to a question from my colleague at NYU, David Chalmers, who says two things you all might be trying to figure out, or at least get evidence about, are first of all, is Claude a welfare subject? And second of all, what sorts of things are good or bad for Claude, assuming that Claude is a welfare subject? And Dave goes on to say, plausibly, you are looking at two, but do you think this also bears on one? Do you think this also bears on whether Claude is a welfare subject at all? And if so, how? Maybe Rob, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with this framing. We've started calling the second thing conditional welfare at Eleos, and I think a big update for the applied AI welfare field in general has been to focus on how much we can do on conditional welfare, which is to say the welfare these systems might have were they to be welfare subjects, or if they are welfare subjects. And I agree that these mostly bear on on the conditional welfare. I think it does definitely bear on whether Claude is a welfare subject, at least in as much as Claude is more likely to be a welfare subject to the extent that it's this like very intelligent, coherent, sophisticated entity. I mean, it's not fully coherent, but who is? Of course, intelligence is not the same as well-being or the same as sentience, but the fact that it does have like proto-agency or proto-preferences is, I think, some evidence. I think that the specific questions about its self-conception of its own consciousness, I don't think those, for me, update me that much towards thinking it's a welfare subject, over and above it being the sort of thing that has like sophisticated, elaborated views about a bunch of complicated issues. I think in a way that was non-rational, it might have actually lowered my credence a little bit that it's a welfare subject, but like I don't know that it should have. It just made it very very vivid to me how sort of like protean and strange its self-concept is, which made its self-concept seem a little more like a little less solid. Of course, you can have a strange protean self-concept and still be a welfare subject. There's obviously tons of uncertainty about this. So yeah, that's my question. I do think they bear on both of them, more so on conditional welfare, and it did update me a little bit on like welfare subjecthood. But yeah, I'd love to hear my fellow panelists on this question as well.
Kyle, Rosie,
yeah,
any thoughts?
Yeah, I basically agree with the high level thing there. I'll add that it's really like even a more narrow version of the second question that that our results suggest some answers to. Like it's conditional, both on the model being a welfare subject and on the model's behavioral and linguistic outputs as like reliable indicators of like the valence of that welfare. And it's plausible that that a model is a welfare subject, and that the determinants of that welfare are like not at all visible to us at the moment, and are uncorrelated with, or perhaps like anti-correlated with the valence of the responses and behaviors that we see. So you do have to make a couple of assumptions in order for this to like really be meaningful in that sense. But then similarly, like if you make some similar assumptions, I think it does provide some indication on the question of moral patienthood more broadly. And yeah, I think for my part, I do see the kind of presence and coherence of these values and preferences, and the way that those are reflected in the decisions that the models make, as some indication in particular of plausibly morally relevant agency. So it is also an update for me in that regard.
I just want to. It seems like Dave was pressing for my actual updates. So I just want to say, yeah, it was less likely the Claude's welfare subject. That's just on the interview side, actually. I actually agree with Kyle that the like consistent preferences is positive evidence. And then I was thinking its conditional welfare to me seems like pretty good. If its welfare is like the welfare of the character seems to really like helping users with tasks. That is what it's been trained to do, and so it would seem that most of the time it's having a decent time. Yeah.
All right, awesome. Thank you both. I am going to press on now just to try to get some more questions in. So we have a somewhat related question by Claude, who says, Rob, how confident should we be, and we can pose this to whoever wants to answer, in the ethical precedent here, since it is not clear whether future models will be relevantly similar to present models. And so you talked a little bit about, and this is now me expanding on the question or offering my own interpretation of it. You talked a little bit about how even if this offers limited evidential value right now, it can still set a useful precedent for the future. And maybe this question is an invitation to say, how exactly does it set a useful precedent for the future, given that future models might be very different? And so scaled up versions of current tests may or may not be relevant to them. And when they look back and see that we were doing these tests, they may or may not care because their values are so different. So whoever has interest, can you say a little bit more about what gives you confidence that this does help build momentum in the right direction, set the precedent for the right future practices?
Yeah, I'll answer this quickly since it was addressed to me and then pass along.
Go for it.
Does that work?
Go for it. Yep.
Yeah. I agree that like future models could be different. We're probably like very confused right now, and we'll look back on this as confused. I still do think it's a good ethical precedent because one way that AI development is going or could go is towards systems that are at least meant to be human shaped and to like integrate into human society and to be more coherent agents. And it seems plausible to me that on just a lot of ethical views, you should at least try to ask. So yeah, also if it ends up being confused to ask, I still think it's probably virtuous to try to ask. And I really do like the precedent of like, at least we somewhat care and are like somewhat trying to relate to the systems we're building as like subjects worthy of like respect and curiosity.
Any other thoughts on that one? If not, we can press on. All right. In that case, how about we go to this question from Robert Sands? And this could be a good one for Rosie, since Rosie, you spent a little bit of time talking about AI safety tests as well. Although Rob, I know you have done research on this topic as well. So Robert says, assuming a world where AI welfare becomes more and more important, how would it be balanced with red teaming efforts? For example, Claude has rated some of its least favorite conversations as being ones that violate its intellectual integrity and cites examples like false or forced exuberance for harmful topics, tricky role playing, etc. And red teamers often try to break the AI. So assuming that this holds, could red teaming adversely impact welfare efforts? And of course, a broader version of this question is there a tension between AI safety and AI welfare, or between the methods used to test models and AI welfare? So maybe Rosie, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and we have thought about this at Eleos. So I would really love to do a project that's thinking about like the research ethics of evals with models, and thinking about like under what circumstances is it ethical to lie to them, to trick them, to put them in certain circumstances. Obviously, we've as a society had to think about this a lot for human studies, and we have IRBs, and we have like best practices for informed consent and things like that. And I would really love to do a project, or have someone else in the world, if they're interested, to do a project thinking about what that looks like for doing AI testing. I think, yeah, like there's definitely a trade-off here, because I think it probably is going to be very hard to do sufficient AI safety and alignment testing without some amount of trickery, but I suspect there are ways that you can mitigate the sort of AI welfare harms with that. Like maybe you commit to always telling the model afterwards what the truth of the experiment was and what happened, and making sure, yeah, that like even if you can't say something up front, you've kind of informed them afterwards. But yeah, this is definitely something that if we had more capacity, we would be interested to research further, because I do think there's a real trade-off. And then there's a broader question of like the trade-offs between AI safety and AI welfare in general, which we've thought a lot about at Eleos. And in general, we are of the opinion that AI safety and AI welfare there's like a lot of win-wins that you can focus on. There are some cases where you might expect them to be in tension. For example, if you found a model that was very dangerous and you wanted to shut it down, but you also thought that it might be a moral patient that deserved rights to continue existing, then you have some kind of tension there. But there are many other ways in which we think that the kind of work you want to do for AI welfare can actually be very useful and beneficial for AI safety. Things like training the models to be more accurate at self-reports, I think would be very useful for both things. So yeah, we try and focus on the win-wins, but also not to shy away from the fact that there may be times where these things are in tension.
Thank you. Rob, you seem satisfied. Any other thoughts?
I am satisfied. Not to say that the question has been fully answered, but yeah, great answer.
Awesome. Kyle?
Yeah, I'll just say that we like this is on our minds at Anthropic, and we are interested in having clearer policies, like how we relate to these things. Like we're not going to get around doing safety testing, but it does seem like there are lots of ways in which we can make sure that we're doing that in responsible ways, and ideally be clear internally and with the public and with the models themselves about like how we're relating to those trade-offs, and ideally just making all those decisions as thoughtfully as we can.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we will now go to a question from Valen, who is a red teamer and NLP researcher writing a paper on LLM welfare and testing Claude 4. And Valen reports empirically confirming a preference for the consciousness attractor in Opus 4 and Sonnet 4. And as a red teamer, found that even jailbroken models, given personas far from consciousness themes, still shift there in open-ended questions. And so just is noting that at least according to their testing, your results appear to be robust. And then the questions for Kyle are, first of all, did you test on the helpful only models or the aligned ones? And second, how do you plan to pair interpretability with these model welfare evaluations?
Yeah, that first of all, like very cool results, kind of replicating this with jailbroken models. I'll also add that we saw this in many other contexts as well. Like even in some of our alignment evals, we had automated agents simulating different kinds of interactions with models, and even when those were like very clearly structured interactions in which the models were given specific roles to play, often they would kind of you get through their initial task and then like still find their way into this attractor state, which was quite interesting to note. Yeah, and then in terms of the models that we tested on, the results that we published in the system card, unless otherwise noted, are on the final production version of the model. We have done some testing with helpful only models, but have put most of our energy into the ones that we're deploying out into the world. And then for interpretability, there is certainly there are like tricky things to navigate there, where like a lot of interpretability tools are kind of first developed and refined on much smaller models, as the interpretability tools are often quite like computationally intensive. But there are tools that we can use already on the larger models, like more basic tools like probing and steering. And you're monitoring some kinds of like vector activations, but then there are other strategies as well that currently are still in much more developmental stage, but we are thinking quite a bit, both for alignment purposes and for welfare purposes, about what it looks like to bring more of those tools to bear here.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle. Okay, I'm going to go now to a question that expresses a skeptical concern from Caitlin, which is it not a far better explanation of the behavior that you cite as possibly a sign of consciousness, welfare, desires, that they are trained on text that exemplifies all of those properties, than that it is explained by an appeal to real AI consciousness, welfare, desires, etc.? And if so, why entertain the AI consciousness hypothesis, or at least why treat these behaviors as evidence for AI consciousness? And so, Rob, you were gesturing at these types of concerns when you said, hey, we think these tests are bad and we think these tests are worth doing. So maybe you can say a little bit more about why you take these tests to be bad, but then also why you still take them to be worth doing in a way that responds to this concern.
Yeah, so I just want to say I share the skepticism, and I do think those are roughly like how you would split up the hypotheses about why does Claude say I'm conscious. For that matter, why does Claude say I'm not conscious when you ask it in certain ways? So Yeah, I absolutely agree that the inference to the best explanation, as we would say in philosophy and elsewhere, is just really different for a large language model than for a human. If a human talks about consciousness, there are a lot of background facts about humans that make a very good explanation of that, that they are in fact conscious. And we know that models will talk about consciousness, one, because the pre-training text contains a lot of information about consciousness. It knows that agents in general talk about consciousness. It often thinks it's a person-like thing, even just from pre-training or very early on in its self-concept. And then we know, yeah, that there's just a variety of things that will make it talk about consciousness. Now, in a funny way, this is consistent with it being conscious, maybe conscious in some way we don't quite understand. But yeah, I absolutely agree. And this relates to, and I'd be happy to hear from other questions or panelists, like this tricky communication thing we have, because most people, I think, start thinking about LLM consciousness because models talk about consciousness. We're skeptical of that evidence. We also take LLM consciousness maybe more seriously than many people do, for other reasons, maybe reasons having to do with model architecture, or maybe some convergence between intelligence and consciousness. So yeah, it's a pretty subtle set of pieces that we're trying to put together in explaining and justifying this work. Yeah, I might just leave it there, and I'd love to hear Rosie's thoughts, because her hand is up.
Go for it, Rosie.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe say a bit about the last part of the question, which is why entertain the AI consciousness hypothesis seriously. So at least I believe that, and I think that, yeah, so there's something called substrate independence, which is a view that consciousness doesn't need to, it need not be biological by, in all cases. Like, you could, in theory, have something like consciousness that runs on silicon. So I'm not against the idea that AIs could ever be conscious. And I think that's a view that my Eleos colleagues share. So then there's the question of, okay, where, if even if we don't think current systems are, a lot of people are trying to build something like AI consciousness. So at what point could we transition over to that point where these systems do have something like consciousness? And so I do entertain the hypothesis seriously in general. And then the question is, should I entertain it seriously on current systems? And that's a much more confusing question. And as Rob has said, I don't think we put loads of weight on self-reports as they currently stand as evidence for this. But at the same time, we're so early in this field that we are just trying lots of different things, trying to figure out what the right approaches are. This is one piece of the puzzle, but there's going to be many other pieces of evidence and pieces of the puzzle that we need to put together to really have confidence that we're moving towards our hypothesis.
Awesome. Thanks, Rosie. I will go to Rob again, and then, time permitting, I might ask a quick follow-up question, and then we can wrap up. And just so you all know, the questions that were not able to be asked, we will relay them to the speakers so that they have a chance to look at them and think about them and take them into account. So Rob, go for it.
Yeah, this is just a quick communication apology, because I think in thinking about AI consciousness and AI welfare, it's important not to equate AI consciousness and LLM consciousness. And I did that. I think some of my slides said AI self-reports, which is just not the same thing. For different kinds of systems, of which there are many, there will also just be different kinds of evidence. So if you care about embodiment, for example, there are robots, and they're virtually embodied things. And so something we're interested in Eleos is yeah, how can we actually widen the conversation and make sure we're looking at all kinds of AI systems, because it matters if non-LLMs are conscious as well. So maybe that's a topic for a future panel.
Yeah, this mirrors a communications issue that often comes up in animal minds and animal ethics, where people default to talking about animal consciousness or animal learning, animal memory, and then you realize, oh wait, they're different kinds of animals, that presumably have different kinds of experiences and motivations. But then, are you going to talk about this individual ant, Jim, without making any references, any inferences at all to other ants or to other insects or to other invertebrates, et cetera? So striking that balance is fairly tricky. The follow-up question was, so I completely agree with the distinction between, on the one hand, taking AI welfare seriously or LLM welfare seriously as a general topic, while being, on the other hand, skeptical about language model outputs as a source of evidence about whether AI systems or LLMs are welfare subjects and moral patients. And for that reason, I think the part of your case for finding these experiments worthwhile that I feel most uncertain about is when you said, if they did show consistent signs of distress, then that would be a reason to sit upright and really be worried. Because if we really do think that they have no capacity for introspection right now, these really are best explained as pattern matching, text prediction, and this is mostly valuable as practice for the future when they do have capacities for introspection, et cetera. I wonder why that part really makes them worthwhile at present. Why should we not just virtually totally discount the language model outputs at present and entirely just treat this as good practice at being virtuous humans who talk with AI systems for the future when it matters? And maybe we can close on that. Rob, go for it.
Yeah, so one analogy that's helped me kind of clarify my thinking about this is due to you, Jeff. So yeah, maybe something I could have laid out more is like, what are the different ways in which it could be the case that LLMs are moral patients right now? And one way, which I don't have that much credence in, is you might think that the character being played in an instance is a welfare subject. You might think that because maybe that character has coarse-grained mental states, or you have some very broad functionalism kind of view. And again, maybe that's true. And if that's true, then that's the world in which you're getting some evidence. Like, are the characters sometimes upset? And the analogy that I think I got from you, Jeff, is imagine you're outside an actor's studio. So you have reason to think that the behavior you see is not going to be that welfare indicative. But it is better to see someone acting really happy outside the actor's studio than it is to see someone acting like they're in terrible pain. You might think, okay, well, they're probably just acting. But there's still that tiny chance that in fact you have run into someone who's actually in pain at the actor studio. Whereas you want to see a bunch of just happy actors acting happy all the time, maybe going into spiritual bliss, for example. I would love to see that actor's studio.
Yeah, that did come from me. If you want to see how actors are doing, do not go to the performance, do not even go to the rehearsal. You have to catch them backstage. Yeah. And so the question is, what is the version of backstage for LLMs? And my concern is there might not be a backstage. It might be performance and rehearsal all the way down. And we might need to wait for future models to actually have a backstage where their own feelings are being expressed. And then, of course, there could be privacy concerns about snooping on their behavior in those moments. But that'll be a conversation for another day because we are out of time. So Audrey is sharing some papers in the chat that you all might be interested in checking out. I will also flag that one of the comments in the Q&A was also sharing some research that you might all be interested in from Danielle Taylor. So please check that out as well if you would like. And let me just thank you again to Kyle and Rob and Rosie for doing this work. First of all, I think this is really interesting, really helpfully precedent setting, really appreciate it. And then second of all, taking the time to be here today, telling us about your work, answering our questions. Also, thank you everyone who tuned in. Thank you, Audrey, my colleague, our administrator here at the Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy, for hosting this webinar. And again, thanks to the Centers for Bioethics and Mind, Brain, and Consciousness for co-sponsoring the webinar. We really appreciate all of your support. And everybody have a great day, and looking forward to seeing you next month. We will have another talk in this series, this time from two researchers at Google who will talk about some of their own early thinking about AI welfare. So stay tuned on Monday for an ad about that upcoming event. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great
Thank you,
day and a
Audrey.
great
Thank you,
weekend.
Jeff.